They called it the War of Brothers, a brutal conflict where families turned against each other, cities burned, and over 2 million lives were lost. But behind the bloodshed was a deeper story, a struggle for power, identity, and survival. This is the story of the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, the conflict that almost tore Africa's most populous nation apart. What happened between 1967 and 1970 still echoes through Nigeria today, shaping its politics, its people, and even its relationships with the world. Before the war, Nigeria was meant to be the giant of Africa. Independence from Britain in 1960 brought so much hope. 3 major regions were united under one flag. The north, dominated by the House of Fulani, the west, controlled by the Yoruba, and the east, led by the Igbo. But beneath this fragile unity, deep-seated distrust was already growing. The British colonial structure had played favorites, leaving a legacy of inequality. Political power was concentrated in the north, while the east boasted a highly educated elite. The west, meanwhile, was caught in a constant struggle of political chaos and ethnic rivalry. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. By 1966, things were reaching a boiling point. Corruption was rampant, ethnic tensions were at an all-time high, and political rigging had become the norm. Then, on January 15, 1966, that spark finally came. A group of young, idealistic army officers, most of whom were Igbo, staged Nigeria's first-ever military coup. They assassinated top politicians, including Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa and the powerful northern leader, Ahmadu Bello. Their stated goal was to end corruption and create a fairer Nigeria. But for many, especially in the north, it looked like an Igbo plot to seize control of the country. In the coup aftermath, Major General Johnson Agui Enigbo took power as the new head of state. He tried to unify the nation by dissolving the regional structure and creating a single, centralized government. But this move, intended to unite, only deepened the suspicion and fear. To many, it confirmed their worst fears of Igbo domination. Just 6 months later, in July 1966, northern officers struck back with a vengeance. A bloody counter-coup erupted. Iron C was brutally assassinated, and hundreds of Igbo soldiers and civilians were hunted down and killed. A young Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon from the north became the new leader of the fractured and bleeding nation. Following the counter-coup, a wave of horrific violence swept across northern Nigeria. In cities like Kano, Kaduna, and Jos, thousands of Igbo civilians were massacred in brutal pogroms. The stories from that time are harrowing. Trains and lorries heading east, supposed to carry people home to safety, arrived filled with the bodies of the dead and wounded. A mass exodus began. Terrified families fled the north, abandoning their homes, businesses, and everything they had ever known, seeking refuge in their ancestral homeland in the east. The eastern region, led by its military governor, Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, was overwhelmed with refugees and grief. Ojukwu demanded justice for his people and guarantees for their safety. He felt the federal government, led by Gowon, was either unwilling or unable to protect them. In a last-ditch effort to avoid all-out war, the leaders met in Aburi, Ghana, in early 1967. There, they seemed to reach a breakthrough, agreeing to a loose confederation that would give the regions more autonomy. There was a glimmer of hope. But once they returned to Nigeria, that agreement completely fell apart. Each side interpreted the Aburi Accord differently, and the trust was gone. Nigeria was officially on the brink of collapse. On May 30, 1967, Ojukwu made a fateful decision. Citing the massacres and the failure of the federal government to protect his people, he declared the eastern region an independent nation, the Republic of Biafra. The announcement was met with massive celebrations across the East. For many, it was a moment of liberation, a promise of safety and a new beginning. But in the capital, Lagos, the federal government saw it as an act of treason. The line had been crossed. Just over a month later, on July 6, 1967, Nigerian federal troops advanced into Biafra. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at the university town of Nsukka. The dream of Biafra was about to become a nightmare of fire, hunger, and death. In the early days of the war, the world was stunned by the Biafran army. With surprising speed and skill, they launched a daring offensive called Operation Torchlight. They pushed west, capturing the entire Midwestern region and advancing perilously close to Lagos itself. For a moment, it seemed like the impossible might happen. But the Nigerian federal forces, with their superior numbers and resources, quickly regrouped. They launched a massive counterattack and, crucially, imposed a complete land and sea blockade. Biafra was cut off from the rest of the world. Supplies of food, medicine, and fuel dwindled to almost nothing. This is when the war took its most tragic turn. The blockade became a weapon, and the main victims were civilians. International media began broadcasting haunting images from inside Biafra. Pictures of starving children, their ribs visible through their skin, their eyes hollow and sunken, shocked the global conscience. The world watched in horror as a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable scale unfolded. Kwashiorkor, a severe form of malnutrition, became a household word. A few countries, like France, Tanzania, and Côte d'Ivoire, recognized Biafra's independence, offering some political support. Brave humanitarian groups like the Red Cross and Caritas organized daring nighttime airlifts, flying planes into makeshift airstrips under the cover of darkness to bring in life-saving food and medicine. But it was a drop in the ocean. It was never enough. By 1968, the war had become a full-blown humanitarian disaster. It's estimated that over 1 million civilians, the vast majority of them children, died from starvation and related diseases. The name Biafra became a global synonym for hunger and suffering. These images fueled the rise of modern international relief movements and forever changed how the world responds to humanitarian crises. On the federal side, the government stood firm behind its powerful slogan, "To keep Nigeria one is a task that must be done." For them, this was a war to preserve the nation's unity at all costs. But for the Biafrans, this was a desperate fight for survival. It wasn't just about secession, it was about protecting their right to exist, free from persecution and violence. By 1969, the end was near. The Federal Army had systematically squeezed the life out of Biafra. Its territory had shrunk to a tiny, surrounded enclave, a fraction of its original size. The Biafran forces were exhausted, outgunned, and starving alongside their people. Ojukwu, desperate and defeated, made final appeals for a negotiated peace, but none came. On January 9, 1970, with his republic collapsing, he fled into exile in Côte d'Ivoire to continue the struggle politically. His deputy, General Philip Effiong, was left with the heartbreaking task of ending the war. On January 15, 1970, exactly 4 years after the first coup, Effiong officially surrendered to General Gowon. The war was over. After 30 long months of fighting, the guns finally fell silent. But the cost was staggering. Over 2 million lives had been lost, both soldiers and civilians. In his victory speech, General Gowon famously declared a policy of no victor, no vanquished. He initiated programs aimed at reconciliation, reconstruction, and reintegration to heal the nation's wounds. But scars that deep don't disappear overnight. The war left behind a legacy of economic hardship, profound ethnic distrust, and political instability that continues to affect Nigeria to this day. The echoes of the Civil War are still present in modern Nigeria. The calls for justice, equity, and a more balanced federation continue. For some, the idea of Biafra is not just a historical event but a living aspiration. The Nigerian Civil War was so much more than a fight for territory. It was a profound struggle for identity, for equality, and for the very soul of a nation. The story of Biafra is not just a piece of Nigerian history, it is a universal human story of resilience in the face of tragedy, and the enduring quest for hope. As we remember the millions who suffered and died, we must also hold onto the crucial lesson they taught us. Peace is fragile, but it is always worth protecting. If you learned something new and want to explore more stories that have shaped our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it. Thank you for joining us on Taleverse, where history comes alive. Until next time, never forget the past, for it holds the keys to our future.